My name is Ella. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known as the calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who never raised her voice, never made scenes, never needed much. People often describe me as easygoing, sometimes lucky, occasionally even boring. I've learned that when people can't quite see your inner life, they label you with whatever makes them most comfortable. I was a wife, a professional, a dependable presence in other people's stories. If you'd asked anyone who knew me back then, they would have said I had a good life, stable marriage, shared memories, a future that looked tidy from the outside. And I didn't argue with that description, not because it was entirely true, but because it was easier to let others believe it. This isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or rewriting the past to make myself look like a hero. It's about clarity. About what happens when you realize that silence, while often mistaken for weakness, can also be a form of deep observation. For a long time, I believed my marriage was built on love, patience, and mutual history. Then, one quiet discovery reframed everything. I discovered my marriage was built on someone else's pain. Not dramatically, not all at once. It arrived slowly, like a truth that had been waiting for me to become strong enough to hold it. What followed wasn't chaos. It was stillness, a recalibration of memory. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. I began to understand that every happy memory belonged to another person first. The vacations, the inside jokes, the traditions I thought we created together, they had echoes, origins I was never told about. This story isn't about confrontation or explosive moments. It's about what happens internally when the narrative you've been living inside quietly collapses. About how power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just rearranges your priorities. I'm sharing this now not because I want sympathy and not because I think my experience is unique. I'm sharing it because many of us have lived versions of this story, being underestimated, being cast in a role that benefits others, and confusing endurance with virtue. If you stay with me through this, you won't hear shouting or dramatic reveals. You'll hear a reflection. Process, choice. The slow reclaiming of self-respect without spectacle. So before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever looked back at a relationship you trusted and wondered which parts of it were truly yours? To understand what happened later, you need to understand who I was to the people around me, especially to my husband. Not who I thought I was, but who I functioned as in their lives. I was the reliable one, not the exciting one, not the complicated one. I was the woman you could count on to remember birthdays without reminders, to smooth over awkward moments at dinner, to listen without interrupting. I noticed how often people spoke freely around me, assuming I wasn't keeping score. They mistook my quiet for absence, my composure for neutrality. In my marriage, I was described as steady. That word came up often. Steady like a background rhythm. Steady like something that doesn't demand attention because it's always there. I took pride in that once. I thought steadiness meant trust. When people talked about us as a couple, they spoke about how well we worked, not how deeply we connected, how efficiently we operated. We hosted without stress, we traveled without conflict, we planned without friction. From the outside, it looked like compatibility. From the inside, it felt useful. I was the one who adapted. If plans changed, I adjusted. If moods shifted, I accommodated. If something was forgotten, I remembered it. Not because anyone asked me to, but because the space was always there for me to fill. And when you fill space long enough, people forget it was ever empty. Friends would joke that I was low maintenance. I smiled when they said it. What I didn't say was that low maintenance often just means high tolerance. It means you don't complain when something is missing. You convince yourself you don't need it. In group settings, I was often the listener while others told stories. Even my husband's stories. He spoke confidently, comfortably, and often nostalgically. I noticed how easily people leaned into his memories, how familiar they sounded, how practiced. I noticed because I pay attention. I always have. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't ask questions that might slow the rhythm of the room. I let the story move forward without me in it. At home, My role was quieter but clearer. I handled the logistics of life, the scheduling, the follow-ups, the invisible labor that keeps things from unraveling. If something worked smoothly, no one noticed. If something went wrong, I noticed immediately. And I told myself this was a partnership. I wasn't ignored in obvious ways. That's important. There was no cruelty, no shouting, no overt dismissal. That's what made it easy to stay. What made it harder to see? My invisibility was subtle, wrapped in politeness and praise. I was appreciated for my function, not my presence. When I did speak up, rarely, it was received kindly, then quietly set aside. Not dismissed outright, just deprioritized, as if my needs were suggestions, not signals. Over time, I learned which parts of myself fit easily into the space I was given. The calm parts, the agreeable parts, the parts that didn't require much response. And I trimmed the rest, not consciously, not dramatically, just enough to keep things peaceful. I told myself this was maturity. I didn't feel unhappy. That's another important truth. I felt muted, like a color slightly dulled by constant light. Nothing was wrong enough to justify discomfort, but nothing was vivid enough to feel mine fully. If you had asked me then who I was to my husband, I would have said I was his partner, his anchor, his support system. And I believed that was enough. I believed being chosen once meant I was still being chosen every day. What I didn't yet understand was that being useful can sometimes be mistaken for being loved. And when that happens, the person who benefits rarely questions the arrangement. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I made it easy for others not to look too closely. And for a long time, that felt safer than asking what they might see if they did. The first moment didn't arrive with impact. There was no argument, no raised voice, no sudden shift in behavior that would have justified alarm. It was small, almost forgettable, which is exactly why it stayed with me. We were at a dinner with friends. Nothing formal, just one of those familiar evenings where everyone already knew their roles. The conversation drifted toward travel, toward favorite places, toward stories that had been told often enough to sound effortless. My husband began talking about a coastal town he loved. He described it vividly, the light, the food, the way mornings felt there. People leaned in, someone laughed, someone asked when we'd been. He paused for half a second, then said, "Before I met Ella." The room didn't react. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? It was an honest detail, delivered casually. I smiled. I even nodded, as if to affirm the timeline. But something in me tightened. Not because the past existed. I was never naive enough to believe I was his first experience of joy. It was the way the story was framed, the way the memory was offered was whole, intact, untouched by me, as if I were a footnote added later, not part of the meaning of the place. He continued, unbothered, talking about how those years shaped his taste, his preferences, how he'd always wanted to go back. Someone turned to me and asked if I liked the coast too. I said yes, not because I had been there, because I hadn't, but because saying no would have required explanation. An explanation would have disrupted the ease of the moment. So I agreed with a version of myself that didn't yet exist. That was the first cut. Not deep, not visible, just enough to make me aware of something I hadn't noticed before. I was standing inside a story that had started without me and hadn't fully adjusted to my presence. On the way home, he was relaxed, pleased with the evening. He talked about how nice it was to see everyone. I listened. I always listened. And I considered mentioning how that moment had landed for me. I didn't. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself it was healthy for people to have lives before each other. I told myself that love wasn't erased by history. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The part I didn't say out loud was this. The story hadn't included me even when it could have. He could have said, "I went years ago, and I've always wanted to take Ella there." He could have bridged the past to the present. He didn't think to, and no one noticed. Over the following weeks, I became aware of other moments like it. Not frequent enough to form a pattern yet, but present enough to register. References to music he loved back then. Traditions, he said, he'd always done this way. Opinions formed long before I entered the picture, still shaping the present without question. None of it was cruel, none of it was intentional. That's what made it dangerous. Because when something hurts but doesn't seem malicious, you look for the fault in yourself. You assume the discomfort is yours to manage. So I managed it, quietly, internally. I told myself I didn't need to be at the center of every memory. Those relationships were layered, that the past was allowed to exist. And again, true, but incomplete. What I hadn't yet named was the difference between a shared past and an inherited one, between building something together and stepping into something already built. That dinner stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of jealousy, but because of displacement. I felt slightly out of alignment, like I'd missed a step everyone else took naturally. I didn't confront him, I didn't withdraw. I simply began to notice more. And once you start noticing, even the smallest cuts leave a map. Once I noticed the first small cut, I became more attentive, not suspicious, not resentful, just alert. Like someone who's felt a draft in a room and started paying attention to where the windows are. What I found wasn't a single open window. It was a pattern of tiny gaps. It showed up in conversations first. He would reference decisions as if they were already agreed upon. Plans for holidays, ways we usually did things, without checking whether those habits had ever truly become ours. When I hesitated, even briefly, he would look surprised, not defensive, just confused, as if my uncertainty was an unexpected variable in a solved equation. I learned to smooth that over quickly when he said, "You're fine with this, right?" It wasn't a question that invited thought. It was a confirmation he expected, and most of the time I gave it. Not because I didn't have an opinion, but because expressing it felt like unnecessary friction. I told myself flexibility was a strength. That compromise was maturity. Over time, I stopped noticing how often I was the one compromising. There were moments when I did speak more clearly, small ones. I would suggest doing something differently or questioning a tradition that didn't resonate with me. He never shut me down outright. Instead, he would explain. He was very good at explaining why something mattered to him. Why had it always been that way? Why changing it might feel strange. And somehow, by the end of those explanations, my preference felt smaller, less urgent, less reasonable. I began to internalize a quiet rule. If something mattered deeply to him and only mildly to me, it should stay as it was. What I didn't examine was how often I had convinced myself my feelings were mild. Friends reinforced this without meaning to. They admired how understanding I was, how I didn't get hung up on details, how I let things go. Each compliment subtly trained me to keep letting things go, even when something inside me wanted to be held. I normalized it by telling myself that all relationships have asymmetries, that someone always cares more about certain things, that love isn't a ledger. And again, there was truth in that. But it became a convenient explanation for a growing imbalance. The disrespect, if you could call it that, was never loud enough to protest. It was quiet, polite, wrapped in routine. It lived in assumptions, not insults, in default settings that always seemed to favor one history, one emotional center of gravity. And because it was quiet, I matched it with quiet. I stopped bringing certain things up at all. Not because I was afraid of his reaction, but because I had learned the outcome in advance. I knew which conversations would end with me nodding, saying, "That makes sense," and swallowing the rest. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I didn't see yet was that peace, when consistently one-sided, becomes erasure. The more I adapted, the more natural it seemed for others to expect it. My flexibility hardened in my role. When someone is always reasonable, they become the person others reason past. I didn't feel angry. That came later. At this stage, I felt responsible. Responsible for maintaining harmony. Responsible for not being difficult. Responsible for managing my reactions so no one else had to adjust theirs. I even defended him internally. I reminded myself he wasn't doing this on purpose. That intention mattered more than impact. That he loved me in the ways he knew how. And because I loved him, I accepted that. But normalization has a cost. Every time you explain away a small discomfort, you teach yourself not to trust it. Every time you minimize a feeling, you shrink the space you're allowed to occupy. By the time I realized something was wrong, I had already practiced being okay with too much. The disrespect didn't escalate. It settled. It became the background noise. of my life together with him. Quiet enough to ignore, constant enough to shape me. And I told myself that if nothing was breaking, nothing needed fixing. I didn't yet understand that some things don't break. They fade. The realization didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as a feeling, an unease that surfaced whenever I imagined acting differently than I usually did. I began to sense that there was a version of me everyone expected. Not consciously, not maliciously, just structurally. A role that had formed quietly over time, reinforced by repetition and reward. I was the stabilizer. In my marriage, that meant I absorbed uncertainty so he didn't have to. If something went wrong, I recalibrated. If emotions ran high, I lowered the temperature. If decisions needed to be made, I framed them in ways that felt easiest for him to accept. I had become fluent in his comfort, and the more fluent I became, the less space there was for mine. I noticed how often I anticipated needs before they were spoken, how I adjusted my schedule without being asked, how I made myself available emotionally and practically in ways that felt natural to me but were rarely reciprocated in the same form. When I was tired, I didn't show it. When I was uncertain, I resolved it internally. When I needed reassurance, I talked myself out of needing it. Not because he wouldn't give it, but because I had learned not to require it. That was my role, capable, undemanding, endlessly accommodating. Outside the marriage, it wasn't much different. At work, I was the one who fixed things quietly, who noticed inefficiencies and smoothed them out without needing credit. People trusted me because I didn't make problems visible. I solved them before they became problems. That pattern felt familiar, comforting even. It aligned with how I had always moved through the world. But somewhere along the way, I began to understand that being relied on is not the same as being seen. In my marriage, emotional labor flowed in one direction. I tracked moods. I remembered details. I adjusted tone and timing. He, in turn, trusted that I would. That trust wasn't abuse. It was dependence. And I had trained him into it. The hardest part of realizing your role is recognizing your own participation in its creation. I didn't challenge assumptions because challenging felt unnecessary. I didn't ask for more because I told myself I already had enough. And in doing so, I made myself easy to place and easy to overlook. When something bothered me, I filtered it before speaking. I removed the emotional edges. I presented it as a thought experiment rather than a feeling. That way, it wouldn't feel like a demand. That way, I could remain reasonable. But in being reasonable, I was also becoming predictable. I saw now that I had been assigned the role of the woman who doesn't disrupt the narrative, the woman who fits neatly into someone else's established life, the woman who makes things better without changing their shape. Reliable, useful, invisible. And because I performed that role well, no one questioned whether it was fair. There was a moment, small, almost embarrassing, when this crystallized. I had a rare weekend to myself. No plans, no obligations. I mentioned, casually, that I might take a short trip alone, just a few days. His reaction wasn't anger or concern. It was a surprise. Not, "Is everything okay?" But why? That single word carried more weight than he realized. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely confused. As if the idea of me choosing something independently didn't fit the version of me he had learned to rely on. I answered smoothly, gave a logical reason. He accepted it. The moment passed. But I didn't, because I saw in that exchange the outline of the role I had been living inside. I wasn't expected to need space. I wasn't expected to want something that didn't orbit around us. I was expected to be present, supportive, and consistent. And I had been. Up until then, I had believed roles were negotiated, that they evolved through mutual understanding. What I realized instead was that roles often emerge when one person adapts faster than the other notices. I didn't feel resentment yet. I felt awareness, and awareness, once it arrives, doesn't shout. It waits. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation, no moment you'd mark on a calendar. It was ordinary, almost forgettable. That's why it mattered. I was alone in the house that afternoon, a rare overlap of schedules that left me with quiet time I hadn't planned to fill. I wasn't searching for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I was doing something practical, organizing a cabinet where old documents had accumulated over the years. Receipts, Manuals, expired warranties, the small paper trail of shared life. I found an envelope tucked behind a folder that wasn't mine. It had his handwriting on it. Familiar, confident, the kind of handwriting that doesn't hesitate. Inside were photographs. Not many, just enough to tell a story. At first I thought they were old travel photos I hadn't seen. That didn't bother me. We all have corners of our lives that don't get shared in full. What caught my attention wasn't the existence of the photos. It was their repetition. The same places he had described with ease. The same coastal town. The same cafe, he once said, felt like home. Only now did I see the context. Another woman, not posed dramatically, not obviously romantic, just present, integrated, comfortable in a way that suggested duration, not novelty. There was no shock, no spike of emotion, just a quiet alignment of pieces that had already been on the table. I sat down, not because I felt weak, but because standing felt unnecessary. This wasn't about infidelity. The timeline was clear. This was before me. What unsettled me was something else entirely. How complete the life in those photos looked. How familiar the smiles were. How seamlessly the rituals I thought we shared had been transferred. I realized then that I hadn't just stepped into a relationship. I had stepped into a continuation. The trips we took, the restaurants he favored, even certain phrases he used affectionately, they weren't improvised. They were inherited, polished by repetition with someone else, then offered to me as if they were newly formed. And in that moment, a sentence formed in my mind with absolute clarity. Every happy memory belonged to another person first. Not all of them, of course, but enough. Enough to shift something fundamental in how I understood my place in his life. I didn't feel jealous of her. I felt displaced by the narrative, as if I had been cast in a role that had already been rehearsed, complete with blocking and lines I didn't know I was repeating. I thought back to the dinner, to the stories, to the ease with which he referenced the past, without bridging it to me. And suddenly the pattern made sense. This wasn't malice. It was convenient. It was easier to keep loving the same way than to learn a new one. I stayed there for a long time, not scrolling, not spiraling, just holding the awareness, letting it settle into my body without rushing to name it as betrayal or loss. Because something else was happening alongside the sadness. Detachment. For the first time, I wasn't trying to understand him. I was understanding myself, understanding why I had always felt slightly off-center, why the relationship felt functional but not fully mutual, why I had adapted so easily because the structure already existed. All I had to do was fit. I put the photos back, carefully, exactly where I found them. That mattered to me. I wasn't there to expose or accuse. I wasn't ready for answers because I wasn't ready for confrontation. What had shifted wasn't my trust in him. It was my trust in the story I had been telling myself. I realized then that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean pause. And that pause, that internal, unshared recalibration, was the beginning of something irreversible. After that day, nothing changed on the surface, and everything changed underneath. I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid of what he'd say, but because I already understood the shape of the truth. Confrontation, I realized, wouldn't give me clarity. It would interrupt it. I needed time to let the knowledge settle without being reframed by explanation. So I chose silence, not the silence of suppression, the silence of observation. I spoke when necessary. I responded as expected. I moved through our routines with the same calm competence I always had. If anything, I became easier to live with, more agreeable, more self-contained. He mistook that for stability. What he didn't see was that my silence now had boundaries. I was no longer absorbing everything automatically. I was noticing what I gave, what I withheld, and how little was noticed either way. I stopped volunteering information about my inner life, not out of punishment, but out of discernment. I wanted to see what he asked for when it wasn't offered freely. The answer was not much. Days passed, then weeks. He didn't sense a withdrawal because I hadn't made one obvious. I was still present, still functional, still kind. I just wasn't filling in the gaps anymore. I let pauses exist. When he talked about the past, I listened without reacting. When he referenced old preferences, I didn't adapt automatically. I let my neutrality stand, not cold, just unyielding, and something interesting happened. The more I didn't compensate, the more his assumptions became visible. He would assume I was fine, assume I agreed, assume I would adjust. And when those assumptions weren't quietly met, he felt a vague discomfort he couldn't quite name. He didn't accuse me of anything. There was nothing to accuse. Instead, he asked questions that sounded like logistics but were really about reassurance. Everything okay? You seem tired. Work stressing you out? I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't offer emotional summaries. I didn't translate my internal state into something easy to resolve. I was learning the difference between transparency and access. Silence, I discovered, is often read as compliance when it's familiar. But when silence shifts from reflex to intention, it becomes unsettling to those who benefited from it. I also noticed how much time I suddenly had. Mental space, emotional bandwidth. When you stop pre-processing the world for someone else, you reclaim energy you didn't know you were spending. I started writing again, not about him, but about patterns. I noted moments where I would have previously intervened to smooth things over and didn't. I watched the outcomes. Most of the time, nothing catastrophic happened. Things simply remained unresolved, and that was fine. I realized how often I had prevented him from experiencing the natural consequences of his own emotional habits. This wasn't manipulation, it was a withdrawal of unpaid labor. The silence sharpened my perception. I saw how often love had been conflated with accommodation, how easily appreciation faded when reliability was constant, how comfort can turn into entitlement without anyone intending it to. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. Anger would have been easier to explain. What I felt was calm, focused, awake. I had crossed a line internally. Before, my silence had been a reflex, to keep things smooth, to protect the connection. Now it was a choice, to protect clarity. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being passive. It becomes power. When people think of preparation, they imagine visible action. Phone calls, late nights, secret plans. What they never notice is the quiet kind, the kind that looks exactly like nothing at all. That was my advantage, because to everyone around me, I hadn't changed. I was still composed, still cooperative, still dependable. I hadn't announced a boundary or staged a transformation. I had simply stopped explaining myself, and in that space I began to prepare. It started with attention. Pure, disciplined attention. I listened not to respond, but to understand patterns. I noticed how decisions were made, whose preferences were centered, whose discomfort was quietly managed, usually mine. I paid attention to timing, to tone, to what was remembered and what was forgotten. I documented without drama, not in a way that would alarm anyone, just notes, dates, conversations that felt slightly off, commitments that shifted, moments when my contribution was assumed rather than requested. Patterns only become undeniable when you stop rationalizing them. I also began learning, not about him, but about systems, legal structures, financial frameworks, emotional dynamics. I read quietly, carefully, without the urgency of someone trying to escape. I wasn't running, I was orienting myself. I learned what independence actually requires, not emotionally, but practically. What documents mattered, what timelines existed, what rights were automatic, and which ones had to be claimed intentionally. I checked facts instead of asking questions, because questions invite narratives, facts don't. At the same time, I repositioned myself subtly. I took on projects at work that increased my autonomy. I strengthened professional relationships that didn't rely on my agreeableness, but on my competence. I stopped downplaying my contributions. No announcements, no explanations. At home, I continued as before. On the surface, I cooked, I participated, I showed up, but I no longer overextended. If something wasn't handled, I let it remain undone. If a decision hadn't been made collaboratively, I didn't rush to finalize it. The silence did its work. What they never noticed was how much I had once been holding together. How much effort did it take to make things feel effortless? When that effort quietly withdrew, the structure didn't collapse, but it revealed its imbalance. He grew subtly unsettled, not alarmed enough to confront, just enough to feel slightly off. He couldn't locate the source because nothing had changed in a way he could point to, and I didn't help him locate it. I was careful not to weaponize my knowledge, That wasn't the point. The point was alignment, to make sure that whatever came next would be grounded, ethical, and irreversible, not reactive. I wasn't gathering leverage to punish. I was gathering leverage to choose. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. There were moments when I almost spoke, when I was almost explaining what I was seeing, but I stopped myself, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. Once you name something out loud, it becomes a negotiation. I wasn't ready to negotiate. I was still deciding, and that decision required quiet. The truth is, most people don't notice preparation when it doesn't inconvenience them. They assume stability is permanent. They assume silence means satisfaction. They assume the roles will hold. They rarely ask who's holding them. I didn't change my expression. I didn't change my tone. I didn't even change my routines dramatically. I changed my orientation from inside the relationship to the side of it. And once you're no longer inside something by default, you can see its shape clearly. That was the phase no one saw. The phase where nothing happened and everything was set in motion. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I felt triumphant or devastated. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does when you've prepared yourself to receive it. By then, I wasn't looking for confirmation of betrayal. I already knew the emotional architecture I was standing in. What I needed was precision. I needed to understand exactly what I was consenting to by staying silent, and what I could choose instead. The clarity came through a convergence of small facts. I reviewed the documents carefully, timelines I aligned, conversations I replayed without softening their edges. Patterns I had once explained away now lay side by side, impossible to ignore. I saw how much of our shared life was built on continuity rather than creation. How decisions were rarely made from scratch, but inherited, from habits, from preferences, from a version of him that existed long before me. And then I saw my leverage. Not leverage in the sense of control over him, but leverage over myself. I realized that I was far more independent than the relationship narrative suggested. Financially stable, professionally respected, emotionally regulated. I had been acting as if leaving would dismantle my life, when in fact, staying had required far more maintenance than I had acknowledged. The real reveal was this. I wasn't trapped. I was just accustomed. That distinction recalibrated everything. I also understood something else. Something subtler, but more important. He believed the relationship was stable because it required so little from him. He mistook my emotional labor for compatibility, my adaptability for alignment. He didn't see the imbalance because it had never inconvenienced him. And I didn't feel angry about that anymore. Anger would have implied surprise. I felt clarity. And clarity doesn't rush. In private, I allowed myself to grieve, not the relationship as it was, but the version of it I thought I was building. I grieved the idea of mutual discovery, of being someone's first choice in the present, not just a capable continuation of the past. But grief didn't make me smaller. It made me precise. I stopped imagining conversations that would make him understand. I stopped rehearsing explanations. Understanding, I realized, wasn't required for change. Consent was. And I withdrew mine, silently, internally, completely. From that point on, every interaction was measured against a new standard. Does this require me to disappear in order to function? If the answer was yes, I noted it. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I simply recorded the truth. The private reveal wasn't about discovering what he had done. It was about discovering what I had been tolerating, and why. I wasn't interested in exposing the past. I was interested in exiting a future that required my continued erasure. And once that intention crystallized, there was no urgency, no panic, just direction. I didn't need him to change. I needed to move, quietly, correctly, on my terms. There is a moment after clarity settles in when you realize that understanding alone is no longer enough. You can see the truth clearly, name it accurately, and still remain exactly where you are. That's the dangerous part. Awareness without decision becomes its own form of delay. I reached the decision point without drama. It wasn't a single night of reckoning or an emotional ultimatum. It was a quiet inventory of options, laid out calmly, honestly, without romanticizing any of them. Option 1, stay and renegotiate. I imagined what that would require. Conversations, explanations, emotional labor, the slow process of convincing someone that the structure they benefited from was unsustainable. Even if he listened, even if he tried, the relationship would still be built on correction rather than choice, on repair, not reciprocity. Option 2? Stay and continue as before. That option was the easiest to visualize because I had already mastered it. I knew exactly how to survive there, how to smooth things over, how to remain useful, reasonable, and invisible enough to keep things functional. But I also knew the cost. Staying would require me to keep explaining my own absence, to keep inheriting a life rather than creating one, to keep teaching myself that being loved meant being adaptable. That option wasn't neutral. It was a slow agreement to disappear. Option 3, leave. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but deliberately. This was the option that carried finality. The one that couldn't be reframed later as a misunderstanding or a phase. The one that didn't ask for permission or validation. Leaving meant accepting loss. Not just of the relationship, but of the version of myself that had tried so hard to make it work quietly. It meant stepping out of a familiar role and into uncertainty I would have to navigate alone. But it also meant something else. Integrity. I realized that staying would require ongoing self-betrayal. Leaving would require courage, but only once. Staying would ask for it every day. That was the moment the decision made itself. Not emotionally, ethically. I didn't announce it. I didn't even fully articulate it yet. I simply stopped considering the first 2 options as viable. They fell away, not because they were impossible, but because they no longer aligned with who I was becoming. The decision point wasn't loud. It was a narrowing. From many explanations to one direction. I felt calm afterward, not relieved. Calm, as if a long internal debate had finally concluded without needing a winner. I understood then why people mistake quiet exits for coldness. They don't see the hours, the weeks, the months of deliberation that come before the door ever opens. By the time the body moves, the mind has already left. I didn't need to be right. I needed to be whole. And from that moment forward, everything I did, every silence, every choice, every step, was aligned with that decision, even if no one else knew it yet. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. That surprises people when they hear it later. They imagine a sharp turn, bags packed, voices raised, lines drawn. What actually followed was methodical, quiet, almost boring from the outside. I moved in silence because silence was already fluent to me. The first thing I did was slow everything down, not externally, internally. I stopped reacting to the relationship as if it were my primary axis. I began treating it as one part of a larger structure I was carefully rebalancing. I handled practicalities without signaling intent. I gathered documents casually, the way one does when organizing. Financial statements, shared accounts, insurance details, password resets that looked like routine security updates. Nothing secretive, nothing rushed. Just accurate. I consulted professionals the same way I consult anything important. Calmly, privately, with questions prepared. I didn't dramatize my situation. I didn't need validation. I needed information. And information has a way of restoring dignity. At work, I continued to expand my independence. I accepted opportunities that aligned with my long-term stability rather than short-term convenience. I positioned myself not as the flexible support role, but as someone whose absence would be noticed. At home, I maintained the same rhythms, meals, conversations, even laughter. That part confuses people the most when they hear it. They ask how I could laugh while preparing to leave. The answer is simple. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't counting down days. I was disentangling. There's a difference. I stopped initiating future-oriented conversations, not because I wanted to punish him, but because the future I was building no longer required consensus. When he talked about someday plans, I listened without correcting or affirming. I let them remain hypothetical. He didn't notice at first. Why would he? I had always carried the emotional continuity of the relationship. Without that labor, time became strangely loose. Plans floated without anchoring. Assumptions went unconfirmed. He felt it eventually, but only as a mild unease, a sense that something wasn't quite clicking. Not enough to investigate, just enough to feel off balance. And I let that discomfort exist. I didn't soothe it. I didn't explain it. I didn't absorb it. That was new. Moving in silence meant resisting the urge to be understood. It meant trusting my preparation more than my desire for recognition. It meant allowing the relationship to reveal its own fragility without me pointing it out. I was careful not to turn silence into cruelty. I remained kind. I remained honest. But I stopped overfunctioning. If something required joint effort, I waited. If something required emotional interpretation, I left it uninterpreted. If something went unresolved, I didn't rush to resolve it. I watched how much I depended on myself without anyone realizing it, and I adjusted accordingly. This phase wasn't about disappearing. It was about reappearing to myself. By the time the consequences began to surface, the groundwork had already been laid. Quietly, cleanly, without spectacle. Because when you move in silence, you don't announce change. You arrive there already standing. Consequences rarely arrive as punishment. More often, they arrive as an absence. At first, the shifts were subtle. Things that used to happen automatically no longer did. Decisions stalled. Emotional cues went unanswered. The small, invisible corrections I used to make without thinking simply didn't occur. And without them, the system started to wobble. He began to feel it before he understood it. A sense that things were slightly harder. Those conversations didn't flow as smoothly. Those plans required more effort than before. He couldn't name what was missing, because what was missing had never been acknowledged. I noticed his confusion before he did. He started asking more questions. Not the kind that seek understanding, but the kind that seek restoration. Are we okay? Did I do something? You seem distant. I answered truthfully, but minimally. I didn't deny the distance. I also didn't explain it. Distance, I had learned, doesn't need justification. It needs recognition. What unsettled him most wasn't my calm. It was my neutrality. I wasn't upset. I wasn't withdrawn in an obvious way. I simply wasn't compensating anymore, and that forced him into a new position. He had to feel the weight of his own assumptions. The emotional ease he had grown accustomed to, the sense that everything would be handled, was gone. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a utility, you only notice when it stops working. He tried to restore equilibrium by doing what had always worked. Being pleasant, being affectionate, referencing shared history. But without my automatic reinforcement, those gestures floated without impact. They weren't wrong. They were just insufficient. I could see the moment he realized something fundamental had changed. Not when I said anything, but when I didn't. When I didn't step in to smooth over an awkward moment. When I didn't preempt discomfort. When I let silence stretch without filling it. He wasn't used to that silence. It had always belonged to me. And now it was no longer available. The consequences began to ripple outward. Friends noticed a shift in our dynamic, though they couldn't articulate it. Things felt different, less seamless, less polished. No one blamed him. No one blamed me. There was no obvious fault line to point to. That's what made it so destabilizing. When a system fails quietly, people don't know where to direct their frustration. They just feel the loss of something that used to make life easier. He became more attentive, but not in the way I once needed. He paid attention to the symptoms, not the structure. He tried to restore the version of me that had kept everything running, but that version no longer existed. I didn't correct him. I didn't punish the attempt. I simply didn't return to the role. This wasn't revenge. It was gravity. When you stop holding something up, it doesn't fall because you pushed it. It falls because it was never balanced to begin with. And as the consequences continued to unfold, I remained calm. Not because I lacked feeling, but because I had already processed it. What he was experiencing in real time, I had lived through months earlier. That's the difference between being blindsided and being finished. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. That's the part people misunderstand most. They assume relationships end because someone stops trying. What actually happens is that one person tries for so long, so quietly, that when they finally stop, it looks sudden. He moved from confusion to concern, from concern to urgency. Conversations changed tone. He asked to talk, not casually, but with intention. He started referencing the future again, this time with more care, more inclusion. He made space in ways he hadn't before. Months earlier, it would have mattered. Now, it is registered as an effort without alignment. I could see him working to restore what he believed we had lost. He was attentive, present, even self-reflective in small ways. But all of it was oriented toward repairing the structure, not questioning whether the structure itself had been fair. He wanted to make things feel like they used to. I no longer wanted that version back. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't withholding emotion to be difficult. I had already metabolized it. The grief, the disappointment, the quiet erosion of self. I had processed all of that alone, in advance. So when he arrived with concern, I met him with calm. That calm unsettled him more than anger would have. He asked what I needed, and for the first time I didn't translate the answer into something manageable for him. I didn't soften it. I didn't offer a checklist. I told him the truth, without accusation, that I no longer felt like a participant in my own life, that I had spent years adapting to a space that was never truly negotiated. I didn't believe the imbalance was intentional, but that it was real. He listened, he nodded, he apologized, and still, something remained unchanged, because an apology addresses behavior. What I was facing was structure. He asked what he could do differently, and I realized then that I didn't want to teach him how to love me. I didn't want to supervise my own repair. I didn't want to become the instructor in a relationship where I had already been doing most of the work. It wasn't that I didn't believe he could change. It was that I no longer wanted to wait and see. The urgency he felt now came from loss, not from awareness. He wanted to fix things because they were slipping away, not because he had understood them when they were intact. That mattered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old wounds in detail. I simply didn't reopen negotiations that I had already closed internally. Too late doesn't mean impossible. It means misaligned timing. By the time he wanted to rebuild, I had already stepped out of the blueprint. And that's when he finally understood something was ending. Not because I said so, but because I wasn't reaching for reassurance anymore. When someone stops asking to be seen, it's not because they've given up. It's because they've already seen enough. The final conversation didn't feel like a confrontation. There was no surge of adrenaline, no emotional crescendo. It felt more like closing a door gently, with intention, making sure it didn't slam. We sat across from each other in a familiar room. The setting was ordinary enough that it could have been any other conversation we'd ever had. That ordinariness mattered to me. I didn't want the moment to feel theatrical. I wanted it to feel true. He spoke first. He was careful with his words now, measured, thoughtful. He asked if there was still a way forward. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the transition from silence to clarity. I told him I wasn't angry, that I didn't believe he had set out to harm me. That much was true, and it mattered to say it out loud. I didn't want the end of our marriage to be reduced to blame. Blame is loud. It obscures understanding. Then I told him what I had learned about myself, that I had spent years adapting to a space that never fully adjusted back, that I had mistaken being needed for being chosen, that somewhere along the way I stopped feeling like a first presence in my own life. I didn't raise examples. I didn't relitigate moments. I didn't list evidence. I spoke in principles, not accusations. He listened quietly. That surprised me. I could see him trying to understand, not defensively, but earnestly, but understanding I knew wouldn't change the outcome. He asked if there was something he could do now. I told him no, because nothing could be done, but because anything done now would be in response to loss, not recognition. I explained that I didn't want to be loved urgently. I wanted to be loved attentively, without needing to disappear first. The room stayed quiet after that. I didn't fill the silence. I let it exist. For once, I didn't manage the emotional temperature. I trusted him to sit with it. He asked if I had been planning this for a long time. I answered honestly. I said I had been listening for a long time. That planning was something else entirely. I could see the moment when he realized this wasn't a phase, or a tactic, or an attempt to regain balance. It was an exit. There were tears then, but not the kind that demand response, just recognition. Grief is catching up to reality. I didn't apologize for leaving. I didn't justify it. I acknowledged the shared history without promising to preserve its shape. When we stood to end the conversation, there was no dramatic closing line, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted and could not be shifted back. The confrontation, if you could call it that, had no heat because it didn't need any. Fire is for battles still being fought. This one was already over. After the end, people expected a transformation they could recognize. They looked for anger or relief or reinvention, loud enough to be legible from the outside. When they didn't see it, some assumed I was struggling. Others assumed I had hardened. A few assumed I had always been like this and were simply seeing it clearly for the first time. The truth was quieter. I didn't become someone new, I became someone unburdened, without the constant calibration, without the need to anticipate, soften, adapt. I discovered how much of myself had been held in reserve. My days felt lighter, not because they were easier, but because they were mine. I no longer translated my needs into something more acceptable. I stated them plainly, and when they weren't met, I didn't argue. I adjusted. I learned that peace doesn't come from being agreeable. It comes from being aligned. I rebuilt my life deliberately, but not dramatically. Same city, same career trajectory, refined rather than replaced. Same values, sharpened by experience. I didn't burn anything down. I simply stopped maintaining what no longer fit. Relationships changed around me. Some people struggled with the fact that I no longer overextended. They missed the version of me that made things easy. Others met me where I was and found something sturdier there. I didn't chase intimacy anymore. I evaluated it. The most surprising change was internal. I stopped second-guessing my perceptions. I trusted the quiet signals I used to dismiss. I no longer needed proof strong enough to justify leaving. I recognized that clarity itself is sufficient. I also realized the need to be understood by everyone. That desire had kept me explaining myself long after explanation was useful. Now, I let my choices speak. Not loudly, consistently. I don't regret my marriage. It taught me how easily love can become a performance when one person is always adapting. It taught me that being chosen once is not the same as being chosen daily, attentively, in the present. Most of all, it taught me that quiet people are often not passive. They are observant, they are patient, and when they move, it is with precision. Who I am now is not someone hardened by loss, but someone clarified by it. I don't seek dominance. I don't need to prove anything. My power comes from knowing when to stay silent, and when silence has finished its work. I live without needing to be central in someone else's story. I am fully present in my own. If there is a lesson in this story, it isn't about leaving. It's about listening, long before you think something is wrong. Most of us are taught to look for obvious signs of failure. Raised voices, betrayals, clear moments of harm. We're taught that if none of those are present, endurance is virtue. That staying calm means staying strong. But there is a quieter truth that rarely gets named. Sometimes nothing is wrong, and yet something is missing. And the longer you explain that absence away, the more invisible you become to yourself. I didn't leave because I was mistreated. I left because I was slowly disappearing inside a structure that required my constant adaptation. I left because love, when it's real, doesn't ask you to inherit someone else's life without space to build your own. This story isn't about villains. My husband wasn't cruel. He was comfortable. And comfort, when unexamined, can be just as damaging as neglect. Not because it's malicious, but because it doesn't notice what it costs the other person. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about authorship. It's about recognizing when your silence is protecting peace and when it's protecting a system that benefits from you staying small. It's about knowing the difference between patience and self-erasure. The hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was admitting that I had been doing too much of the emotional work and calling that love. Once I stopped performing, understanding and clarity arrived without effort. And here's what I know now, with certainty. You don't owe permanence to something that only works when you disappear. You don't need to justify leaving a life that no longer feels like yours. And you don't need an explosion to make a decision quietly, ethically, and completely. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever stayed silent in a relationship so long that when you finally understood the truth, leaving felt calmer than staying? If you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Not for judgment, not for advice, just to be witnessed. And if you're still listening, really listening to yourself, trust that voice. It knows more than you think.